I had a name once that meant a place, and then in the space of one cold morning I had neither. The morning was the 4th of October in the year 1886, and the place was a strip of bottomland along the Coldwater branch in the Ozark Hills of southern Missouri, where my husband's people had farmed for 2 generations, and where I had believed, foolishly, that a wife who buried a husband stayed where the husband was buried. The notice was a single sheet of paper nailed to the door of the cabin that had been mine, and it was signed by my husband's brother, Saul Renner, who had the law on his side because the deed had never carried my name. I stood in the yard with my hands cold and read it twice. The way you read a thing you cannot make, say something different, no matter how long you look. The cabin and the 40 acres around it passed to Saul. I had until the first hard frost to take what I could carry and go. I had a quilt, a Dutch oven, my father's old leather roll of tools, and a brown dog named Tucker who would not leave my heel. What I did not yet understand, standing there reading my own eviction in the thin October light, was that the hill behind that cabin, the worthless rocky shoulder of ground, everyone in the valley had cursed for breaking plows, held the one thing that would carry me through the worst winter the Coldwater country ever saw. If you have ever been handed a paper that took everything and pretended it was only following a rule, then stay with me, because I want to tell you what the rule could not see. I was 31 years old, and I had nothing the valley counted as worth having, and that was the beginning. My father had been a quarryman in the lead country up near Potosi before his lungs gave out, and he had not left me money because there was none to leave. He had left me his hands, which is to say, he had spent years putting into my head the things his hands knew. I was a girl who should have been learning to set a proper table, and instead I was holding a plumb line for him in a limestone cut, learning how stone lay in its beds, which seams would split clean and which would shatter, how the earth held warmth the way a banked fire held it, slow and low and long after the surface had gone cold. He used to put his bare palm flat against the wall of a deep cut in August and tell me to do the same, and the rock down there was cool, and in February that same rock face would be the warmest thing in the county. The ground does not feel the weather the way we do, he told me. Go deep enough and you find a season that never changes. I was 9 years old, and I did not understand it as knowledge. I understood it as my father's voice, and I kept it the way a child keeps a voice, which is to say, I kept it whole. There was one August day I have carried with me my whole life, when he took me down into the deepest cut on the Potosi diggings, a place the other men did not like to go, because the air there was old and still, and he set my small hand against the stone, and held it there, with his own larger hand over mine until I felt it, the cool of the deep rock coming up into my palm in the middle of a day so hot the locusts had gone silent in the heat. Feel that, he said. That is not cold. That is the ground holding back its summer to give you in winter, and its winter to give you in summer, and it will do that for 10,000 years and never tire. And a soul who learns to live with the ground instead of against it will be warm when the proud are freezing. He did not talk like that often. He was a quiet man worn down to bone and coughed by the lead dust, and when he said a thing like that it stayed, the way a nail driven once and driven true stays. I did not write it down. There was no need. It was in my hands already, the way he meant it to be. He taught me other things in those years that I did not know I was learning. How to read a seam of stone by the way the light caught it, which beds would lift clean and which would crumble, how a wall stands by its own weight if the stones are chosen true, and how mortar is a crutch a careful builder does not need and a careless one cannot be saved by, how the deep ground breathes, and how a chamber cut into it must be let to breathe with it, or it will weep water and rot whatever you store there. He showed me a root cellar a settler family up the creek had cut wrong, sealed tight as a drum, and how it sweated and spoiled their winter potatoes every year. And he showed me an old cut the early miners had left open to the south that stayed, sweet and dry, and even after 100 years. The difference, he said, was that the old hands had asked the ground what it wanted, and the new ones had told it. I was a girl, and I should have been at my letters, and instead I was learning the temper of stone and the patience of the deep ground, and I have thanked him for it every cold day of my life. He died when I was 19, coughing stone dust he had breathed for 30 years, and I married a cold water farmer named Eli Renner because he was kind, and because a girl alone in that country did not have a long list of choices. Eli was good to me for 11 years. Then a fever took him in 3 days in the spring of '86, and his brother Saul took everything else by autumn. And I learned that kindness in a husband does not write your name on a deed. I did not go far. That was the first thing the valley found strange, and I knew it would be, even as I did it. A cast-out woman was supposed to go back to wherever she came from, or go to a town and take in washing, or marry quick and poor. I did none of those. I walked up the rocky shoulder behind the cabin, the ground Saul did not want and no one had ever wanted, the hillside they called the Renner Ribs, because the limestone broke through the thin soil in long, pale ledges, like the bones of something half buried. There was a place near the top where a ledge overhung and the hill fell away, and where water had worked at the stone for longer than anyone had been in that country, opening a low seam back into the hill. It was not a cave the way children mean a cave. It was a mouth, a dark, cool throat of stone going back maybe 15 feet before it narrowed, and the air that came out of it on that October afternoon was the same air my father's palm had found in the lead cuts, cool against the heat of the day, which meant warm against the cold of the year. I stood at the opening with Tucker pressed to my leg, and I put my hand flat against the inner stone, the way my father had taught me, and I felt the slow-held warmth of the deep ground, and for the first time since the paper went up on my door, I was not afraid. Saul Renner came up the hill the next morning to see what I was doing, because a man who has taken everything still likes to know the thing he took is not being used against him. He stood at the foot of the ledge with his thumbs in his belt and watched me carrying stones, and he laughed, not cruelly, which was the worst of it, the easy, comfortable laugh of a man who cannot imagine being wrong. "You mean to live in a hole," he said, "like an animal." Tucker growled low, and I put my hand on his head, and he stopped. I told Saul I meant to live where the ground stayed warm, and Saul shook his head the way you shake your head at a child who has said something foolish, but not worth correcting. He went back down the hill, and by Sunday the whole valley had it, and by the next Sunday they had a name for me. The widow in the hole. Some of them said it kinder than others. Most of them just said it, the way you name a thing so you can stop thinking about it. I let them. I had stones to move. What I built that autumn was not a hole, though I understood why they could only see a hole. I built a home with a stone throat for its heart, and I built it the way my father built a thing meant to last, which is to say slowly and from the inside out, trusting the ground before I trusted the timber. The cave mouth I left open to the south, because the low winter sun would reach into it, and the cold north wind would never find it. Inside, where the seam narrowed, I walled off a chamber with dry-laid limestone, fitting each stone to its neighbor, the way my father fit ashlar in the lead cuts. No mortar, just the weight and the bond of stone chosen to sit true. A dry-laid wall breathes, he had taught me, and a wall that breathes does not sweat and rot the way a sealed one does. I laid the back wall thick against the living rock, so the held warmth of the hill bled through it into my room. I built a low hearth near the mouth where the smoke would draw out and up along the stone and not back into the chamber, and I cut a small flue through a crack in the ledge above so the bad air had a road out. Every choice I made, Saul and the valley, read as the strangeness of a grieving woman who had lost her sense. The angle of the opening, the thickness of the back wall, the little flue cut high in the rock. They saw a woman stacking stones in a hole. They did not see that I was building a season that never changes. Tucker dug with me, or near me, the way a dog helps, which is to say he was always underfoot and always warm against my side when I stopped to rest. I cleared the floor of the chamber down to flat rock and laid it with split cedar, so the cold of the stone floor would not climb into my bones at night, because the warmth of deep ground is a low, even warmth, and it will hold you alive, but it will not by itself keep your feet from aching. I learned that the first week, sleeping on bare stone, and I fixed it, the way you fix a thing when the ground itself is your teacher. I split the cedar from a stand below the ledge and laid the pieces close, bark side down, and the difference the first night was the difference between lying on a cold I could not name and lying on a floor that gave nothing back to the cold at all. Above the hearth I set a stone shelf, and on it the Dutch oven, and along the breathing wall I drove cedar pegs and hung what I could put by before winter. The work that took the longest and that the valley understood the least was the back wall. I built it twice. The first time I laid it the way a quick person lays a wall. The stones fitted but the wall, standing a hand's breadth off the living rock, and I slept behind it one night and woke cold, because the held warmth of the hill could not cross that gap of dead air. So I took it down, every stone, and I laid it again tight against the rock face itself, each stone chosen to sit true against the one below and to press its back flat to the living stone, so the warmth of the deep ground had no gap to cross, but came straight through the wall into the room. My hands bled at the knuckles for a week from the fitting of it, because a dry laid wall laid true is fitted with the fingers as much as the eye, and you learn the shape of every stone by handling it. When it was done, I put my palm to the inside of that wall on a cold night and felt the warmth coming through, low and steady, and I knew I had built the thing my father had shown me without ever drawing it, the thing that was in my hands before it was ever in my head. I banked the cordwood against the south wall of the mouth until the stack was a wall itself, and behind it the wind broke and went around, and I cut my little flue high in the crack of the ledge and learned by trial which way the smoke wanted to go and helped it go that way, until the chamber held no smoke at all, only warmth and the smell of cedar and the small sounds of the fire. I had no field and no stock, but I had the woods, and an Ozark hillside in October is not poor if you know how to read it. I gathered hickory nuts and black walnuts by the bushel and spread them on the cedar floor to cure. I dug the last of a neighbor's turned potato ground at dusk, for what the plow had missed, which is a thing a proud woman does not speak of but a living one does. I smoked what small game Tucker turned for me, hanging the strips high in the draw of the mouth where the smoke cured them slow. I traded a day's washing to a widow down the branch for a setting of dried beans and a crock of lard, and I laid in salt and powder and a little coffee against the long dark. By the middle of November, I had a low, warm room in the side of a hill that the whole valley believed was a grave I had dug for myself, and I had a comment to make to the air some evenings, when the work was done and the fire was low, that if any soul down in that valley ever found themselves with nothing but a hillside and a dead man's hands to build with, they might do worse than to remember the widow in the hole. Then I would bank the fire and sleep, warm, while the first real cold came down out of the north. The cold came early that year, and the valley read it wrong, the way a confident place reads everything wrong right up until it cannot. There was a hard freeze the second week of November that killed the late gardens, and then a false thaw, and the men on the porch of Dolan's store, down at the Coldwater Crossing, took the thaw as a sign of an easy winter, and said so. I know they said so because I walked down for salt and powder the third week of November, the last time I went down before the snow. and I heard them. Saul was there, and a big loud farmer named Harlan Pruitt who had the best bottomland in the valley and never let a man forget it. And when I came up the steps, Harlan looked at me and said it to the whole porch, not to me, which is how that kind of cruelty is done. "There goes the widow in the hole," he said. "She'll be froze in her grave by Christmas, and we'll dig her out in the spring." The men laughed, some of them. Saul did not laugh that time, and I marked it the small stopped place in his face, though I did not yet know what it meant. I bought my salt and my powder, and I went back up the hill, and behind me the porch went on, talking about the easy winter the thaw had promised them. They had wood for an ordinary winter. They had their cabins chinked for an ordinary winter. They were farmers of the bottomland, and they had never in their lives needed to know what my father knew, which is what the ground does when the air turns to something that has no mercy. In it, it turned the first week of December. I have lived a long life since, and I have never seen anything come on the way that cold came on. It was not a storm the way a blizzard is a storm, all wind and white. It was a stillness, a clear, hard, sinking stillness. The sky gone the pale, flat color of skimmed milk, and the air so cold it hurt the lungs to pull it in. The creek froze solid in 2 days, bank to bank. The snow that fell was dry as sand, and did not melt, and did not pack, just lay there taking the little warmth the ground had and giving back nothing. I read the thermometer I had nailed inside the cave mouth, my father's old quarry thermometer, the one kept thing of his besides the tools, and on the morning of the 7th of December, it stood at 11 below zero outside the mouth, and inside my chamber, with a small fire and the warmth of the hill bleeding through the back wall, it stood at 54 degrees. 54 degrees while the world outside fell past 11 below and kept falling. I sat with Tucker against my leg and the Dutch oven warm on the shelf, and I understood, in a way I had only believed before, that my father had been right, that go deep enough, and you find a season that never changes, and that the season I had found was going to be the difference between living and not. Down in the valley it was already going wrong, though I did not learn the full count of it until later, and learning it is a thing I have never been able to do without my throat closing. The cold that I met at 54 degrees the valley met head-on in cabins built for an ordinary winter. Harlan Pruitt, who had the best bottomland and the most stock, lost 40 head of cattle standing in his lot in 3 nights, frozen where they stood because there was no shelter. We deep enough to hold warmth against that cold, and not enough hay, because the easy winter had not called for laying in extra. He had laughed on the porch that I would be froze in my grave by Christmas, and on Christmas Day Harlan Pruitt was hauling the carcasses of his own cattle out of his lot with a chain and a mule, and I take no pleasure in setting that down, only the plain shape of it. The Dolan store ran out of lamp oil, and then out of coffee, and then closed, because the road froze too hard for wagons. A family named Causey 4 miles up the branch burned their furniture, then their fence rails, then the very puncheons of their floor, and still the children's hands and feet swelled and split, and they would have been counted among the lost if a neighbor had not taken them in. I heard later that the Causeys burned in 9 days everything it had taken them 9 years to build, and were left with their lives and 4 bare walls, and not one stick of furniture, and that they counted themselves fortunate because 3 families up the same branch could not say as much. The minister at the Coldwater Church, an old man named Briggs, gave out that he had recorded in the church book the deaths of 9 souls in that valley between the 7th of December and the New Year, most of them old or very young, all of them taken by a cold the valley had been told would be easy. 9 souls. He read the names from the book the first Sunday. The road thawed enough for the church to gather, and I was not there, but Effie told me of it, how the old man's voice broke on the 3rd name and did not steady again to the 9th. And up on the Renner ribs, in the hole they had named for me, the thermometer my father left me did not fall below 50 degrees in the worst of it, and I burned less than a cord of wood in the whole month of December, because the hill did the work and the fire only finished it. I was warm, and Tucker was warm, and that gap between 50 degrees and the deaths in the church book is the whole of what I have to tell, and I have never once found it in me to feel anything but sorrow at the size of it. I have thought many times since that if I had not been cast out, if my name had been on that deed and I had stayed in the cabin in the bottom like a proper widow, I would have frozen with the rest, and the knowledge my father gave me would have frozen with me, and no one would have been the wiser. The paper that took everything was the paper that saved my life. I did not understand that the morning I read it. I understand it now. Saul came up the hill on the worst night of all, and that is the night the valley remembers, the night that turned the widow in the hole into something else. It was the 19th of December, and the cold had sat on the valley for 12 days, without lifting, and Saul Renner, who had taken my cabin and my 40 acres, had run out of dry wood, and his wife Effie was carrying a child near her time, and the cabin he had taken from me had a chimney that drew badly in a hard freeze, a thing Eli had always meant to fix and never had. Saul did not come up the hill for himself. I have to say that plainly, because it is true, and because it is the kind of truth this story turns on. He came up because Effie was shaking with cold in a cabin that could not be warmed, and he had nowhere else in that frozen valley to take her, and the last place left to a proud man is the place he mocked. I heard Tucker bark, and then I heard a man's voice broken by the cold calling up from the foot of the ledge, and I came out with the lantern, and I found Saul half carrying Effie through snow that squeaked like dry boards underfoot, the both of them gone past speaking in whole sentences. Help was all Saul could get out. Effie, cold. I did not make him say more. I did not make him say anything at all. I brought them in. I want to tell you what that room was like to walk into out of 11 below, because Effie told me later that she thought for a moment she had died and gone somewhere warm, and I have never heard the place described better. You came through the cave mouth out of a cold that was trying to kill you, past the cordwood wall, into the low chamber, and the warmth met you like a hand laid flat against your chest. The fire was small, because it did not need to be large. The hill did most of the work, and the light of it moved on the dry-laid stone and on the cedar floor and on the jars and the hung herbs and the brown back of the dog. Effie I put under my own quilt by the back wall where the held warmth of the hill came through strongest, and within the hour she had stopped shaking, and within 2 she slept. And the child she carried that night was born healthy in March and is an old woman now with grandchildren of her own. Saul sat by the hearth with his hands wrapped around a cup he could not at first feel, and he looked at the back wall and the flue and the angle of the mouth, the things he had laughed at, and I watched him understand them one by one, the way a man reads a letter he should have read months ago. He sat a long time. Then he said, the thing that the valley still says when they tell this, the only thing he said about it that whole night, and he said it low, looking at the fire and not at me. You knew, he said. That was all. You knew. And then he was quiet, and I let him be quiet, because there are recognitions a person has to sit inside of for a while before they can carry them. And I had no wish to make him carry it faster. The fire ticked. Tucker shifted against my foot. I poured Saul more from the pot and set my hand for a moment on Effie's shoulder where she slept, and felt the shaking gone out of her at last, and I sat back down across the small fire from the man who had taken my home, and I did not say one word about the deed, or the notice on the door, or the porch, or the easy winter, or any of it. There was nothing in me that wanted to. The warmth coming up out of the hill was the only argument that had ever mattered, and it was making itself without my help. And I had learned long before from a man coughing his life out in the lead dust that you do not need to win an argument the ground is already winning for you. Outside the cold went on with its killing, and inside that hill it could not reach us. And Saul Renner sat in the warmth his dead brother's widow had built out of nothing but a hillside and a quarryman's lessons, and he learned what the ground does, which is the thing he had been certain there was nothing to learn. The cold broke at last, in the second week of January, and the valley came up out of its cabins to count what it had lost, and what it had lost was terrible, and I will not pretend the warmth in my hill made the church book any shorter. 9 souls were 9 souls, and no warmth of mine could give them back. The valley also came up the hill, because Saul talked, and Effie talked, and a thing that has saved a man's wife travels faster than a thing that has only been laughed at. They came and stood in my cave mouth where the porch had stood in the cold, and they put their hands against the back wall, the way I had put my hand against the lead cuts when I was 9, and they felt the held warmth of the deep ground. And one by one the valley stopped, saying, "The widow in the hole." By spring 3 families on the Coldwater branch had dug back into the south-facing ledges of their own hillsides, and they came to me first, every one of them, because Saul had learned the hard way that the form of the thing was not the secret. The first man to try it on his own, a stubborn fellow named Pruitt, Harlan's own younger brother, dug straight into a north-facing bank because it was easier ground, and sealed his walls tight with mortar because that was how he knew to build. And his chamber sweated and froze and was useless, and he came to me angry, and I was not angry back. I told him what my father told me. The ground gives its warmth to the one who builds the way the ground asks, not the way the builder wants. Face the winter sun. Let the wall breathe. Lay the back against the living rock. He listened the second time, because the first winter had taught the whole valley to listen, and the chamber he dug the next autumn kept his family warm for 40 years. A man from the county came through that next summer, a surveyor named Otis Calder, who was mapping the watershed for the railroad that was supposed to come and never did, and he heard the story at Dolan's store and rode up the Renner Ribs to see for himself. He was a careful man with a careful book, and he measured my chamber and the angle of the mouth and the thickness of the back wall. And he asked me where I had learned it, and I told him about my father and the lead cuts at Potosi and the palm laid flat against the August stone. He wrote it all down. He wrote down the 54 degrees on the 7th of December and the 11 below outside it, because I still had my father's thermometer and the figures in my own hand. He sat in my chamber the better part of a day, and he kept putting his hand to the back wall and taking it away. The way a man does when a thing he has been told is true turns out to be true in a way he can feel. He told me he had seen root cellars and he had seen dugouts, and he had never seen a thing built on the principle mine was built on, the deliberate use of the deep ground's held warmth, and that it ought to be written down so it would not be lost. It went into his report, and the report went into a drawer in the county seat, and I thought that was the end of it. A thing in a drawer. I was wrong about that the way the valley had been wrong about me. Knowledge in a drawer is a seed in a dry year. It waits. I lived in that hill for 19 years. Tucker died in the 4th of them, old and warm by the fire, and I buried him at the foot of the south ledge where the winter sun would reach him. And I got another dog and then another, but I have never told anyone the names of the later dogs in this story, because Tucker was the one who climbed the hill with me on the day I had nothing, and a story should keep faith with the one who was there at the beginning. He had dug at my side when the valley laughed, and he had been warm against my leg the night Saul came in out of the killing cold, and he had grown gray in the warmth of a room he helped me build. And when he was gone, I sat a long while with my hand on the cedar floor where he had always lain. And then I went on, because the living go on and the ground keeps the rest. Saul Renner gave me back the 40 acres the summer after the cold, with the deed made out in my own name this time. And I want to be honest and say I thought a long while before I took it, not from pride, but because I had learned that a hillside the valley called worthless was worth more than the bottom land they prized, and I was not sure I wanted to come back down. I kept the hill. I farmed the bottom and slept in the hill, and Saul and I were not what you would call close, but we were square. And at the end of his life, he asked me to sit with him, and I did. And neither of us ever said again the thing he had said by my fire, because it had been said once, and that was enough. The valley is still there. The railroad never came, and the bottomland farms thinned out the way frontier farms do. The children going to the towns and the cities, but the hillside chambers stayed in use longer than the cabins did, because a thing that keeps you warm for nothing is a thing the poor hold on to. Otis Calder's report came up out of its drawer 40 years on, when a young man from the state university came through collecting the old ways of building before the people who knew them died, and he found the figures in my hand still legible, the 54 degrees and the 11 below, and he came and found me, very old by then, and he sat where Saul had sat and asked me to tell it again. I told him about my father most of all, because the truth I had learned across all those years was that I had not been the one who saved those families. Not really. My father had, with his hands, 20 years dead, and still teaching, because the only inheritance worth having is the kind that lives in the hands and passes from them into other hands and does not stop. The young man wrote a book, and my hillside is in it, and the principle my father laid into a 9-year-old girl holding a plumb line in a limestone cut is in it, and it did not stop with me, which is the whole of what I ever wanted. I am old now, and I sit some winter evenings in the chamber my father taught me how to build, though I did not know that was what he was doing when he taught me. And the fire is small because it does not need to be large, and the warmth comes up out of the hill the way it always has, slow and low and older than any of us, indifferent to the deeds men nail to doors and the names they fasten to widows. If you walk the Coldwater country today, up where the limestone breaks through the thin soil in long, pale ledges like the bones of something half buried, you can still find the dark south-facing mouths in the hillsides, most of them empty now, a few of them still holding the season that never changes against the worst the winter can do. They look, from a distance, like nothing. They look like holes a desperate person dug. You have to go in and put your hand flat against the back wall and feel the held warmth of the deep ground that does not feel the weather the way we do, to understand that they were never holes at all. They were homes built by people who had been handed papers that took everything, who walked up the worthless hills the valley did not want, and who knew how to ask the ground for the one thing it had always been keeping. The hill keeps it still. Go deep enough, and you find a season that never changes.